at Lund University in publishing studies, and most of my research is on contemporary book market, book sales, and obviously digital change, because that's where everything's happening at the moment, as we all know. As I haven't met you before, I've no idea who you are and the level you're at and what you know about Sweden and what you don't. So please apologize for myself to begin with. Just, we'll see what is too much information and what you want to know more about, and please ask questions. I'm going to talk briefly about publishing in general. I'm going to talk about book sales and the way it looks at the moment, and then obviously digital change. See if we can this work. Yeah. Okay. So the Swedish book market was one of the most regulated in Europe and basically in the world before 1970s. A very strict government control, but also very strict rules and regulations within the system. In 1970, everything changed with a complete deregulation of the market. And now we belong to the countries with the most liberal markets in the world, only compared with basically a few South American countries, the US and the UK, with very, very few regulations and restrictions. However, there are strong cultural policies for supporting authors, publishing, and particularly libraries and schools. But there's no support for commercial distribution and sales. As we will see, this has had particular effects on the Swedish market. And I also want to mention that we have a VAT of 6%. So publishing in Sweden looks a bit like this. We have 3 very, very large publishers, conglomerate publishers. Then there are a few mid-sized publishers, a large group of small independent publishers, and then the large box at the bottom there of self-publishing and micro-publishers. The Publishers Association at the moment is 64 companies, and then there's another 200 among the small independent. And for the rest, some guesses is that it's 50, other guesses it's 500. My guess would be that it's plenty more if you count all the micro publishers that publish a book once in a while. So this is a very divided market, a very polarized market between the very large ones. Bonniers and Storytel in particular, they own outlets, they own internet bookstores, they own streaming services, and they own all sorts of publishing companies. So what we have been able to see is that it's a very divided market. I'll get back to that as well. For those of you who already publish or translate Swedish literature, you will know that the strongest markets in publishing in Sweden as well is crime fiction still, children's books and young adult, and non-fiction. Non-fiction is perhaps the section that is not being translated to that extent internationally, but it is very successful in Sweden. So the overall trends that we can see in publishing is a vertical and horizontal integration. This basically means that the large companies are either owning smaller publishing houses or imprints, so they can basically have publishing in every segment, whether it's textbooks or children's books or general publishing. And there's a strong horizontal integration, so they will own outlets, they will have printing outlets, they will have sale outlets of different sorts. So it's a very, very conglomerate kind of publishing in Sweden for the sort of the dominant 3. So the concentration in the dominant 3 also creates a market of very small companies. So there's a strong polarization between these big ones and a lot of small companies. And these can be companies or initiatives or organizations that will publish occasional books, or people who are interested in translated poetry or whatever it is. But it's a very divided market. And for those who you might be interested in that as well, translated literature is clearly moving from larger publishers to smaller, and that has been a trend for at least a decade, I'd say, but it's growing stronger by the year. And as I mentioned, we have a very strong growth, as in many countries, in micro-publishing and self-publishing. Although it's very hard to keep track of this publishing, as a lot of it is not registered in the National Bibliography. It's not for sale in any sort of the big outlets. So it's difficult to tell how big self-publishing really is. And some of it is ebooks only as well, so that's not a factor. If we look at the figures from last year, 2019, book sales were up about 1%, which isn't much because there's inflation as well, but it's fine. The fiction was the main genre that did really well. Crime fiction and all fiction is included here, almost 10% up. The other big success is obviously the digital streaming services, and I will get back to those at the end, and then digital audiobooks. So what we also can see is that big publishing or the large publishers sold better than smaller publishers. It was very clear. If we look at we actually got figures just the other week for this year, because they tried to see what is happening during the pandemic and how has this affected book sales. And what we can see, not too surprising, is that digital streaming services went up 32%, internet bookstores went up 11%. So this is books that you can access from home. Physical bookstores went down 17% so far. And so what do people read when they're at home? I brought in Swedish, sorry for that, The Year of the Plague, The Death in Stockholm in 1710, and a young adult novel about pandemics. So we are, what is actually doing well is fiction, crime fiction, and cookbooks, because we're cooking from home. But what did not do as well was children and young adult, who went down for the first time in years. So children and young adult has been the success story during the last decade, but actually this was changed this year, which I find surprising. Non-fiction did not do as well as either. I think that's partly due to lack of really strong titles in that segment, but it's hard to tell. And then moving on to markets and sales. And so 1970 is really a dividing year in Sweden. So that's why everything goes back to that year. So what we saw after 1970 was a very price-focused business where price is basically everything. That's how you compete. And that has created a situation where brick and mortar bookstores have a low market share, much lower than many other countries. On the other hand, we have very cheap books, indeed very inexpensive books. And that's also why it's very hard to change, because people like cheap. But what is also clear is that we have a retail system that's very sensitive to market change. So a few years ago, you can and you'd find a big shelf of books. That's gone now. Also the same if you look at sort of small supermarkets or other kinds of small stores where you used to be able to get books, but you can't anymore. So it's a very sensitive sort of system in the market for books. It's because of the brick and mortar only having such a small. This is a slightly old map, but I still find it interesting. It's the dark areas of Sweden here are towns or municipalities without a bookstore, and a change from 1970 to 2015. And if I had this map over 2020, it would be even darker blue, because a lot of bookstores have gone out of business during the last few years. So it's clearly a situation where you have a lot of places where you can't access books commercially. Obviously, there are libraries in every town, but commercially there's no way to buy books in many towns in Sweden. And this has also created a situation where you get this. The sales channels of 2019. Bookstores around 28%, and this is 19, so obviously 2020 is very different, and let's hope it's going to get back to this after that. But so what we saw even last year was that internet bookstores, subscription systems had almost half of the market. And then obviously the digital streaming service and they had already accessed another 32% more, but they had gone up. And so another probably 10%. And this is a very, very strong trend. And if we look at the digital market in 2020, so what we see is that we have these streaming services that I've mentioned now so many times, but they are really very dominant in sort of how people in the market are changing, what publishers are doing, how authors are acting, what authors are writing, and how sort of the infrastructure of publishing has changed. So it's mainly audiobooks. It's a pay-per-month system where you will access everything that's there for free once you pay this. It's like a Netflix account. And they do have a lot of even new books as well. So it's really created a system where you get a lot of published audiobooks. New audiobooks are produced in extremely large extent. You'd think that is expensive, but it's many publishers feel very forced, especially in fiction, but also a bit non-fiction actually. So what has happened is that reading tablets never took off in Sweden. The kind of Kindles or Kobos or so never really had a market. Instead, it's been smart tablets and smartphones and apps. And the apps after smartphones after 2011 and the apps in 2013 really opened for this market. So this is sort of mainly audiobooks in these streaming services, and the ebooks are not really commercially successful. They're still being basically lent out from libraries, and libraries are still carrying most of the costs for ebooks, which they are obviously quite reluctant to do. They don't have the money for resources for that. So there's still a very slow development in ebooks, and then there's a strong development in audio. And we have very strong political ideals of free ebooks, while there's no idea of free audio. I don't know really why that is, but there's sort of a big difference there, how they're treated. What we can see, obviously, is that sort of digital reading in sort of websites or other kind of forums mainly have been successful in textbooks, school books, university texts. So there you find the digital reading, while audio is for leisure. So we have a strong backlist growth. There's no way, because there's no national registration of digital audiobooks. There's no one who knows how large this production is. We can only guess. But I made a survey for children's books last year, well, beginning of this year. And just to give you sort of a sense of this expansion. And the first table there shows the Publishers Association members and their production of children's audiobook. And what you see is obviously a very strong rise in 2016 and following. And then I also gathered information on all audiobook publishing for children. And what we can see is that particularly in 2018, other publishers were even stronger in that segment. And that is actually due to 3 large companies who are not a part of the Publishers Association, who works particularly with audiobook production and has been sort of buying up copyright from out-of-print titles. And they basically contacted copyright holders and asked, can we make audiobooks of your whole catalog? And they usually say, yes, thank you, it's not in print. And that's created quite a bit of tension in the market. Who owns this copyright when it's out of print? Is there a moral right, or is it just legal rights, etc.? But it's a very strong development, and it's very recent. So my guess is, if you look at adult figures, they would be different numbers, obviously, but more or less the same. So we have here the 4 main actors in the streaming services: Storytel, Nextory, BookBeat, and Bokus Play. They're not similar they're very similar in how you use them, but they have different features. BookBeat is owned by Bonniers, for example, which means that they will have particular Bonniers titles exclusives. Storytel are own Norstedts, and they will have other titles exclusive. So that's one way of working with it. The sort of Netflix exclusive original has become a norm in these streaming services as well. Storytel is by far the largest. They have 400,000 paying members in Sweden only, and 1 million worldwide. I will get back to the worldwide. I just want to say as well, they do have a reader for ebooks, but it's not the big thing. Audio is still the big thing here. Here is their world map, because this is how they present themselves. They're aiming for the world. The green areas are countries where they're already present. Mainly they're profitable in the Nordic countries, but they are present elsewhere. The red areas are countries where they are launching in early 2021, and that's including Israel, although that's very small, so you can hardly see that. It's a little red there. So they are expanding still, and they are trying to make these markets profitable. But they, as you can see, they are not moving into English-speaking world, because that's where Amazon obviously is so strong. So they're moving very slowly, and they're starting with other countries. One problem or possibility, or how you want to see it for Storytel when you move into new markets, is there might be not enough audiobooks. So what they have been doing for quite some time now, and they're developing it fast, is that they produce original texts for audio format. They're very much like a Netflix series. They're seasons, and they're 10 episodes, and they're an hour long. So they're very sort of a strict format, and there's even a brief on how to write these, but they are in very different. So there's a zombie for children. There is well, one book on contagion there, on pandemics, and there's all sorts of books. There's absolutely everything. So they can just translate that into their new markets, and they do that as well. And then they are doing the Netflix thing. They're producing new things in Spain, and then they're translating it to other areas. Not every book works in every country, obviously, but this is a very strong backlist for them to use when moving into new countries, and also a way to make them exclusive, obviously. And they get very well-established authors to work with them, because the authors say some of them, a few of these are published under a real name, others are not, because some authors find it very relaxing not to publish under real names, and they get well paid. So they are producing, I think, about 30 seasons or 30 new titles of children's books, and another 50 of adults each year, and they are going up. So to sum up, what we can see is that the Swedish Book Trade Challenges is the sort of digital audio challenge that everyone faces at the moment. Are we all going to listen to literature? Are we not going to read anymore? What does the digital mean? Is there room for print still? And are authors changing? There's sort of a discussion that authors and publishers are changing because audio has become such an important part of the incomes for the publishers and the authors. If they're trying to write for audio, even they're supposed to not. And there's also a discussion on that some more complex text doesn't work in audio, and that makes a sort of it's crime fiction, genre fiction of all sorts that's very popular. Another challenge for Sweden at the moment is obviously it's a small market in the international trade. Sweden has been very successful in exporting crime fiction particularly, but also children's literature. But can you keep that up? Is there a continuing interest in Swedish crime? Or do we have to sort of reinvent ourselves into feel good or whatever it is? And that has to do with import-export, obviously. Sweden has for a very long time been mainly an import country when it comes to literature, and that goes back to the 18th century. And the sort of last 20 years of export of crime and children's literature is sort of a new thing, but obviously has been very important for Swedish literature. And what we all see is that digital is global. You can buy a book from Amazon or from a German store or whatever. It doesn't really matter. So how can you survive as a domestic actor? And how do you do that when it's a global world? So what we also see is that we get new business models, especially the streaming services are offer a different kind of business model. And you get paid for different publishing formats, different kinds of money. And it's very hard both for publishers and for authors to sort of see the whole system for that. It was much easier when you said, okay, we start with a hardback and then we go on to a paperback and then we sort of knew the system, and that has really changed. To begin with, some people try not to publish ebooks immediately because not to sort of cannibalize on your own publishing, but that has changed and now everyone does it basically. And sales channels and consumption is changing. People are reading in different ways or listening or what they do. And that is very difficult, especially then for the physical outlets, both in towns and malls, and especially this year, obviously. And unfortunately, I think we're going to lose quite a few more bookstores. Okay, thank you. I'm going to end there and see if I can bring back you and see if there is any questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Ann. Very interesting, as always, to hear your latest findings in the Swedish literary business. Yes, Maria, did you get any questions in the chat?
No written comments or questions. So I just say that the floor is all ours. And any comments are just welcome to be put to Ann Steiner at this moment.
I think there is a raised hand from Ian here. So did I see?
Hey, Anne, thanks very much for your talk. That was very interesting. And it's always fascinating to find out what's going on in terms of Sweden is a lot more exciting in terms of what's going on the publishing scene. And you've talked about things like the Storytel originals, but also the need for reinvention for exports. But I'm curious, is the wider publishing scene, these micro publishers, and then the sort of weird new kids on the block like Polaris or Strawberry, you've got foreign dollar muscling in on the Swedish market. Are they leading to innovative new things being written and published, or are they just publishing the same old stuff but under a new brand?
I'd say if you talk about Strawberry and Polaris, that would definitely be the case. It's the same old stuff. They're really looking for sort of big books, bestseller titles. They're very good at it. Although Strawberry is obviously bought up now already. That was a very brief excursion into Norwegian money. But the innovative is really coming sort of from the outside of the business, which Storytel is. They are very innovative. And I will also say, I mean, commercial companies, so we have to bear that in mind. But interestingly enough, they're very open to research. So they actually provide us with a lot of data. So for the first time, researchers are allowed to see how people act when they listen and read books. And that's Amazon has had this data for a long time, but they're never given anything away. They provide us everything. And that's fascinating. I'll get back to that next year.
Does Storytel original stuff, do you get the impression it exports well? I mean, you talked about them moving things between their territories, but would you say that Storytel's core focus of Sweden, does that stuff export, or is it Swedish specific?
It exports very well between the Scandinavian countries, definitely. That's not really a problem. So in that sense, and that's also, I think, the countries that are at the moment commercially successful and profitable. And in other cases, I mean, they've opened in the UAE. I would imagine they would have to sort of be very careful what they publish there. And they would choose, especially when it comes to children's fiction, they would choose some things and other things not. But no, I think we have to ask them. I don't know yet.
Amazing, thanks.
I could ask a question. As you truly know everything worth knowing about the book trade in Sweden, and now many things are changing. what will your focus of interest be the coming year when observing and analyzing the book market and the trade?
For me, it is audiobooks and streaming services. So, well, you could probably see that in this presentation. I'm very interested in what's happening in children's books and what that means, that production of audiobooks for children, which is not really a new thing. I mean, we all remember the LPs of the 70s. They were a big thing. So audiobooks for children is really been the only commercial profitable audiobook production. But things are changing very quickly at the moment, and that's something that I'm gonna look more into. Mm-hmm. And I have this amazing data from Storytel. We have over 6 million listenings of books that we are processing in our data sets. So that's enormous amounts of data that they are providing us. So that is also something that will say things about consumption, literary consumption in the contemporary world. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then there is a question from the audience. Elisabeth Wiedemann asks and comments, "Thank you so much for your presentation. As a foreign rights manager, I found it lately easier to sell non-fiction than literary fiction. Is non-fiction, imported or not, becoming more relevant in Sweden as well?"
That's a very good question. I'm surprised to see that non-fiction went down this year. And that might be just, sometimes, it's just one title or two titles that makes a difference for that. But generally, I'd say non-fiction is a very strong segment in Sweden. Quite a few of the really big successes has been non-fiction. And that is interesting. I think they are also transforming them into audiobooks, and they have also been successful in audio format. Although quite a few publishers in Sweden have done sort of short versions. There's a big book on sort of the plague of the 14th century, and it's 800 pages, and then they make a short version of 100 pages, and they do it in print and in audio. So that's been sort of one of those adjustments you can see where authors and publisher work together to make easy access versions of very complex things. So I think that is, and that is one in nonfiction that's where you particularly can see that.
I could comment as a reader or consumer when going into a Swedish bookshop. One can notice that there are titles that have been bestsellers for like 2 years already. The book about plague and the book about the eels, the Gospel of Eels, a biography about a very complex and exciting woman from the beginning of the 20th century. So they are really some few books. They have really been like become steady sellers for a very long period of time. And the books that in the beginning seemed a bit unlikely to become this kind of huge bestsellers. And then there's a question from the floor. Annie Olivier, do you expect the pandemic to have an impact on the kinds of books being published in Sweden, or have you seen it happen already, perhaps? If it did have an impact, do you think it will be a long-term impact?
Well, I think we all feel this year that we're guessing when we're talking about a pandemic. But what we can see, obviously, are titles, the very sort of obviously commercial titles, what happened, and sort of discussions books. You can see those already. Those do not seem to have a real impact. People are not really interested in reading them so far. Do we see? Sweden has not been in lockdown, so we don't see these kind of isolation books that I think we will get in other countries. And that makes a difference. But obviously, we will get fictionalized versions of this. But I don't think it's going to change in any real sense. But it might push a change, because what we have seen, I think, is things that were already sort of semi-happening have sort of get this big push, and then it's really moved there. So the audiobook, the streaming services, it was already there, it was already successful, but the pandemic definitely made it so much easier for them because people couldn't get to bookstores. And they still wanted to read, and so this was a very good and easy way to do it. So I think sort of authors writing for audiobooks, that is something we're definitely seeing more and more of.
And talking about the future, Ian Giles has a question regarding Amazon, that will be expanding to this territory, obviously. What should we expect with the arrival of Amazon as a retailer in Sweden?
Well, as a retailer, it's one thing, and as a book retailer, it's a very different story. They're not really, I mean, what we can see obviously is that Amazon is a retailer today and not so much a bookseller. They're not that focused on it. They have signed contracts with some of the publishers, not everyone. And we do have a very strong internet store and streaming services, so I'm not sure they will be able to take sort of on the book market the way they have in other countries. On the other hand, they are the world's biggest player in book sales. So obviously it's going to be a big change for all of us. But we've talked about Amazon since 1995, I feel. So it's very hard to say this is going to happen.
Yes, this has been sort of one of the subjects of all these years. We have had you as a guest at the fellowship, this Amazon question, but now it's finally happening. So we'll see. Okay, any more questions from the audience? Or otherwise, you're, of course, yes, someone, Maria, you would like to ask a question?
I do not have a question, but before closing the meeting, I would still like to see everybody's faces. Could we have for a short while just look at each other? Would that be okay? Oh,
hello.
Nice.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
This is as close as we get to
Yeah.
a sort of normal book fair event. So nice to see everyone.
Yeah.
But yes, thank you so much, Ann, for this speech. As always, very interesting. And as we said in the beginning, this will be available afterwards as well on our website. We will send out information about that later. And you're also very welcome to write us an email if you have questions about just anything. So, yeah, anything. We want contact. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a nice day. And hope to see you at the other webinars this week.
And stay safe.
Yes, stay safe.
And
bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye for now.